Today at the National Press Club, the independent member for Wentworth, Allegra Spender. She's launching a series of tax white papers ahead of the May budget. The first will outline proposals to help restore intergenerational equity by rebalancing the tax system. Allegra Spender with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. My name's Tom Connell, I'm the club's president, also an anchor at Sky News Australia, and I have to say, after reading some of the content today, unfortunately for me, a PAYG taxpayer. Our guest today is Allegra Spender, the independent member for Wentworth, a seat not long ago held by Malcolm Turnbull and is now independent by more than 8%. Her speech is Tax White Paper number 1, Personal Taxation Fit for the Future. Tax reform, of course, not so long ago, was the preserve of economists and treasury wonks, but the lack of any genuine reform for decades and huge reliance now on the budget on income tax paid by some 16 million Australians mean the debate seems to have gone more mainstream. There are some very different solutions being proposed, with the one thing everyone agrees on: change and major changes needed. Indeed, when it comes to our current tax system, I'm reminded of that old Irish joke about the farmer seeking directions of how to get to Dublin. Well, sir, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. So as they say in middle management, no bad ideas. And for her own ideas, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Allegra Spender.
Thank you for that warm introduction. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land on which we meet and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. So Australia is at an inflection point. The economists know it, the Parliament knows it, actually the people know it. The data is unambiguous, but for years we have chosen not to act. The Australian dream, that if you work hard, make good choices, you can build financial security for yourself and your family, is faltering. And the people who are feeling it the hardest are the ones that we should care the most about, our young people. So today I'm releasing a white paper costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office with a plan to help change that. A proposal that rebalances the personal income tax system, significantly lowering taxes on working Australians, paid for by reducing tax concessions on earnings from assets. It's budget neutral. Every dollar raised goes back to the Australian people as lower taxes on wages. Better rewarding hard work, building prosperity, and ensuring more Australians can build financial security and a decent life for themselves. It may not be perfect. You may have better ideas. Good. Let's have that debate. But the time for admiring the problem, for blaming each other, for playing fantasy tax reform is long past. The coming budget is the best opportunity for tax reform in a generation. It is up to all of us to seize it. So let me start with a story. A couple of months ago, I was running a pop-up office in my electorate in King's Cross. A young woman came over. She'd been watching from across the street, pushing a pram with twins in it. Let's call her Anna. Anna's a doctor at a local hospital. She started as a nurse and retrained. Her husband retrained too. He'd started as a police officer and now as a lawyer. They'd paid off their HECS debts. They'd saved. They'd done everything right. And they still couldn't buy a home. I have a good job, she said to me. I thought I made all the right choices, but we can't afford it, and I think about it literally every single day. And now I think about Anna every single day. What could I say? She's not alone. That this is a conversation that is happening in group chats, on street corners, around kitchen tables across the country. People who studied, who worked hard, who saved, and who still cannot build the life that their parents had. They don't want our pity. They don't want to have to rely on their parents. They are educated. They work hard. They want a system that actually works for them, and they're frustrated that the current system is failing to deliver the opportunities that Australians once took for granted. When I look at the rise of political frustration in this country, the drift towards the extremes, the growing sense that the major parties just don't get it, the attraction to simplistic solutions, I think her story is at the heart of it. Because when people feel like the system is not on their side, They stop believing in the system altogether. That has consequences far beyond any single policy, and we are already seeing that impact. So today I'm here to be honest about what is wrong and to offer up an answer. Honest that no one thing will fix the problems we face, but that each piece matters, each piece must be taken on, including the hard ones, and to present a proposal to fix some of the problems in our personal tax system. So what are we fighting for? For generations, this country has made a simple promise. If you work hard, whether you're a teacher, a tradie, a barrister or a barista, you can build a decent life for yourself. We are breaking that promise. The Australian Covenant isn't written down anywhere. You won't find it in our Constitution, but every Australian knows it. It is the unspoken deal. Work hard and this country will work for you. We have been quietly editing that deal for 20 years. Today, I'm asking us to honour it again. Australia has always tried to have a unique balance, the dynamism of the US without its grinding inequality, the security of Europe without its economic rigidity, prosperity and fairness. Those things should not be in competition. When people believe that their effort will be rewarded, that drives growth and drives fairness simultaneously. But right now, our tax system is working against that covenant. And the longer we leave it, the harder it becomes to deal with it. So there are 3 problems I believe we need to name. Problem 1, hard work isn't paying off, and our tax system is making it worse. Young Australians today are more educated and more likely to be working than any previous generation. Their wealth is stagnating, they have more debt, they are having fewer children and spending less money on non-essentials than previous generations of young people. So it's not the avocado toast. And they are starting fewer businesses. And unsurprisingly, many have much less hope for the future. Home ownership for Australians aged 25 to 35 has dropped nearly 20 percentage points in 40 years. In 1980, 15% of home buyers needed financial help from their parents. Now it's over 40%. Young people are likely to be more disrupted by the coming AI wave than other generations, as more of those entry-level, early career jobs are automated. A generational wealth gap has already emerged. Households over the age of 65 grew their wealth on average from $600,000 to about $1 million in 12 years into 2016. But households under 35 basically went nowhere. And it's not just young people who are worried. Parents and grandparents in my electorate approach me all the time to raise this issue. They can see what is happening to the next generation. One of my volunteers said to me, "Look, I pay no tax on my super, but my daughter, who is working, has to move away because she can't afford a home near me. Look, I want to pay more tax if I can help more people like my daughter make sure that they don't have to struggle so hard right now." Many grandparents and parents want to see this addressed, even when they know that it's not necessarily in their financial interest, because they can see that the system isn't working for their kids and grandkids and isn't working for other Australians either. And they know that fixing it will require all of us to be part of the solution. And the tax system is part of the problem. Like, let's take a concrete example. Take $100,000 worth of income. Earn it in wages like most Australians do, like most young Australians do, you'll pay around $23,000 in tax. Earn it on capital gains on a property you held for more than a year, you'll pay about $7,000 worth of tax. Distribute it through a family trust and split it with a spouse, you'll pay about $13,000 worth of tax. Earn it on $1.7 million of superannuation, and when you're retired, you pay no tax at all. Same income, 4 entirely different tax bills. Now, I'm not saying there aren't reasons for different tax rates and concessions. There really are, and there's some good ones. But the question really is, have we got the balance right? Is it working for either prosperity or fairness? And I think the answer is no. Our tax system imposes the heaviest burden on the one path that is open to almost all of us, working for a living. Problem 2. We tax people the hardest when they can least afford it. Here's a thought experiment. If the average taxpayer pays about $1 million worth of tax in their working life, in income tax, when would you like to pay it? When you are younger, you've got a HECS debt, you're renting, you're saving for a deposit, you're raising children, you're paying a mortgage. Or later in life, when debts are paid, children are grown and wealth is built. The answer is obvious. Yet our tax system does exactly the opposite. Two households living next door to each other, both on $100,000, one working, one retired. The working age household pays twice the tax on average to the retired household. Even though the older household is around twice as likely to own their own home and likely to have 4 times the amount of wealth. Our tax system front loads a burden onto the years of greatest financial stress with our least financial security. We are literally asking the youngest runners to carry the heaviest pack and then wondering why they can't keep up. Now, this isn't an accident of history, it is a policy choice, and we can make a different one. And finally, problem 3. The demographics are moving against us and we are not responding. In the 1980s, there were around 6 working age Australians for every person over 65. Today, it is fewer than 4. In a generation, it'll be fewer than 3. People over 75 will go from around 6% of our community in 2000 to 9% of our community at the end of this decade to 12% by 2040. We spend more money on older Australians than ever before, on health and aged care, and that reflects the values of this country. We care about our parents and our grandparents. We value their lives and their quality of life and their health. But although, I support it, but although it is true that older Australians are less reliant on the pension, average transfers to 75-year-olds are now around 50% higher than they were in the 1990s because of health and other types of transfers and tax systems. And my question really is, how are we going to pay for this? At the same time, the percentage of older people paying any income tax at all dropped from 27% of the population to just 17%. Realistically, we cannot fund a growing burdening of aged care and health services by silently extracting more from a shrinking pool of younger workers. It's not sustainable and it's not fair. Now to my proposal. Let's be clear about what this is and what this is not. It is not about increasing the tax take. I do not believe we should be taking more money from Australians right now when the government spending has already risen substantially and people are not sure they're better off for it. We need to grow the pie, not simply redistribute it, and so this package does not grow government. Every dollar raised from reducing investment concessions is returned to working Australians through income tax cuts. Budget neutral, every single dollar. The centrepiece is cutting taxes on wages and salaries, reducing the lowest rate to 13 cents in the dollar and a 2.5 reduction in every other marginal tax rate. For someone earning $100,000, which is close to the median full-time wage, that's more than $1,600 back a year. For someone on $200,000, it's around $4,000 back. My proposal is a deliberate rebalancing of the tax system to reduce the burden on wage income, to reduce the tax burden when people are younger, when they're trying to get started, trying to build their financial security, and rebalancing the system to when people can better afford to pay that tax. And to fund those cuts, my proposal suggests 4 changes. First, reduce the capital gains tax discount from 50% to 30%. Investors can still earn a positive real rate after tax and inflation. Our own history confirms it. Secondly, ring-fence negative gearing, so investment losses offset against investment income, not against wages. This is pretty standard practice across comparable economies. It ends the perverse incentive that would mean that property investors can reduce their wage tax while outbidding first home buyers in the property market. Third, set a minimum tax rate of 27.5 cents on investment income when there's no labour income. Use our tax-free threshold to encourage people into work and reduce the incentive to use trusts to minimise tax. And fourth, bring the principle of bring principle and stability to the superannuation by aligning earnings thresholds over time more closely with income tax thresholds. A principled system is a stable system. A stable system is one that Australians can actually pay for and plan for. Now, transitions really matter. I've designed this proposal pretty carefully. No one is penalised for decisions made in good faith. But historical advantages are not entrenched. Capital gains tax charges only apply to future gains, but that means future gains on assets currently held are also taxed at a new rate, as are assets bought in the future. Negative gearing changes are phased in over a period of 5 to 10 years. And superannuation changes, some of those over 10 years, with a one-off opportunity for those with high balances to reposition immediately. I'd like to speak directly to those people who would pay more tax under this proposal. I know you've worked hard. I know you've made sacrifices. I know you've made the right decisions for you and your families. You've followed the rules. I'm trying to be genuinely fair in this design. But we also have to be clear-eyed. We are on train tracks and we can see where they head. Not a cliff, not a sudden disaster. Just a slow arrival at a country where your parents' balance sheet starts to matter more than your own ambition. Where people don't have their children or grandchildren that they want because of the financial pressures for the young come all at once. Where we don't know how to pay for the services for older Australians that we care about so much and which they rely on. We can see where we're headed. We do have time to switch the destination, but only if we act now. And I don't believe that's a country we want. This requires trade-offs. It requires change. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Let me answer some of the hard questions up front. Some will say that this will reduce investment. It will not. The evidence from Australia's own history, including the introduction of the capital gains tax in 1985, shows that moderate tax adjustment do not reduce overall investment. It just changes where people invest. What we can do is redirect investment towards productive activity and away from speculative housing. The tax concessions for small businesses and investments in high growth businesses won't change. Some will say the timing is wrong. There is never a perfect moment. But inflation makes the case for reform even stronger, not weaker. And the potential disruption of AI to entry-level employment means it is more important than ever that we reward work and that we reduce our reliance on the taxation of wages. Some will say that the budget has to have other priorities. Yes. Cutting spending, yes. Deregulation, yes. Corporate tax reform, absolutely. Industrial relations reform, resource taxes, making sure that every single taxpayer dollar delivers the biggest impact for the Australian people. But this matters too, and it cannot continue to wait. If you have better ideas, a fairer way to fund meaningful income taxes, a fairer way to fund meaningful income tax cuts, a fairer way to rebalance the system, I genuinely want to hear them. This is a white paper, a proposal, it's not a final answer. But it is a serious one and it demands a serious response. If 25 years ago we had shown Australians a chart of today, where young people's wealth is, where home ownership is, where the birth rate is, and said, this is the system you're voting for, would they have chosen this? Is this the society that we've been seeking? I don't think so. I don't blame individuals for following the incentives that existed. They were doing the right things by their families. I don't blame the policymakers of the past. You don't always know how policies are going to turn out. But the community should hold politicians accountable now. Politicians who know what is happening and who lack the courage to act. To people across this country who feel politically homeless, who feel that the coalition doesn't have a serious policy agenda, that Labor's too cautious, that the Greens aren't realistic, I hear you. And I want to say clearly, anger without a plan is not going to solve this. This is what having a plan looks like. To the government, the Treasurer has put tax reform on the agenda. Good. It is not easy in the rule-in, rule-out world. Now is the time to follow through with ambition and to stick to budget neutrality. Australians do not want higher taxes. Just raising taxes is not tax reform. Keating and Costello knew that. Australians do not want you to change the tax system so that the government has more money in its pocket. They want to see the tax system rebalanced so that there's more money in their pockets and their kids' pockets. To the coalition, this proposal delivers over $28 billion in income tax cuts each year. That's around $10 billion more than the Morrison Stage 3 tax cuts, without adding any more money to the deficit. If you believe in lower income taxes, and if you believe in responsible economic management, here is your chance to prove it. To the Greens, you say you care about the fairness for younger Australians. This is what it looks like in practice. There is a pathway through the Parliament, but it requires political will. And this is the moment for it. There are some that say tax reform is just too hard, that the losers will always be louder than the winners. That is precisely the argument that has paralysed reform in this country for the last 25 years. And I reject it not naively, but on the evidence. Because when you explain to an Australian that a nurse and an investor on the same income pay wildly different levels of tax, they're not indifferent. When you show them that the tax system artificially advantages debt-leveraged property investment over first home buyers, they don't shrug. Australians do understand what fairness means. We have that sense of fairness, that commitment to a fair go in our bones. So I'm seeking to do this with the community, not in spite of it. Alongside this white paper, I'm launching a community campaign to engage the Australian people with the proposal. I'm asking you, challenge it. Tell me what you think should be different. Improve it. And if you want change, contact your MPs and say so. I've already heard from some people who say that they know that they probably would pay more tax under this proposal, and they say, look, I know I need to do it anyway because I don't think it's right for the country what it's like right now. That's the Australian I believe in. Every generation inherits a tax system from the one before. The question is not whether we will leave one to our children, it's whether we will have the courage to improve it. Anna asked me Anna, who I met in King's Cross, asked me whether housing was going to be fixed. I can't promise her a timeline, but I could tell her that there are people in this Parliament working to make the system fairer, to give more Australians a chance to build financial security on the strength of their own effort. This paper is part of this work. The Australian Covenant, a promise that hard work leads to a decent life, is worth defending. This is the time to defend it is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Allegra. You did ask a lot of questions, but I've got a few still, and so do some of my colleagues. Interested in going about this exercise, because it's a pretty thorough one.
Yeah.
Did you go in with any different ideas? You had to actually go, maybe that's not a good idea, whether it have been an inheritance tax or let's not have any new taxes. In doing this exercise, did you actually think there were things you might have done or would like to do that you no longer will because of whether it be budget constraints or fairness or anything else?
Look, we've looked pretty broadly. And look, I'm sure I'll probably get a question on the GST because I think a lot of people would say, you know, isn't the obvious answer the GST? And, you know, for example, when I looked at the GST, I thought, you know, what I came out with is going, wow, it's not the magic pudding that everybody assumes that it is in terms of its ability to really fund income tax cuts. And honestly, politically, right now, you know, with inflation high, Australians do not want to see higher prices on anything, and I just think the GST is politically impossible. So I would say that did look pretty widely, and you know, this is, yeah. So you look widely, but this is where we landed because we felt that this was the best package that could deliver fairness, could really build the system that you want for the future. Because a big part of this is also, it's about helping young Australians get ahead, but it's also making sure that this is robust for another 10, 20 years, because we know that tax reform doesn't come around very often. And so when you build, you have to build for the long term, not just the problems of today.
You also had a message for the Greens and the Coalition. There's another party polling the sort of mid-20s at the moment. Are you reaching out to One Nation as well, given their importance now and maybe more importance in the future?
I think the pathway through the Parliament is with those current numbers. And so that's where, I think this is not something we can put off to the next election. This needs to be, the time to act is now. And I talk to young people. They are not waiting around for another 2 years for an election and election promises. They want action now because this is difficult right now. So we will see what different elections bring. But I think, this does go a bit to this question of trust. When you are not dealing with the issues that are front and centre to people, with their daily lives, then I think people trust politicians less. And that is why I'm saying that there are issues facing people right now that need to be dealt with now, with courage, with real sort of boldness of action. If you leave it another 2 years, they will lose more trust, I think, in the major parties, and they will move further away. So this is why it matters to act now.
Patrick Commons from The Guardian.
Thanks very much for your speech and always thoughtful contribution to tax reform. You've spoken about the urgency of reform and a lack of political courage. We have a government in a historic position to pass really meaningful reform.
Yep.
But they are committed to, in the words of the Treasurer, to bite-sized chunks, to tweaking at the edges. So my question is, do you believe that the government, and Jim Chalmers in particular, is wasting a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make meaningful reform to the tax system? And if they don't seize this opportunity, what does Australia look like in another 10 years?
Look, I don't want them to waste it, which is why I've released this paper and why I want them to be ambitious coming into this budget. I think that this budget is really important. It is really important from a tax point of view. It's incredibly important from a productivity and a spending point of view as well. But this is an opportunity. They do actually have genuinely two pathways to deliver significant reform to the country that will help young Australians and frankly all Australians, I think, have an economy and a community that is better off. And so they shouldn't waste this. And so, I respect the Treasurer putting tax reform on the agenda and he's held it there for the last, since they had, I think he spoke in the press club here. That's not easy to do. He's held it there. Just don't waste it. I think this is the opportunity to be bold. I think people want them to be bold because we recognise that this system is hard. And if you look at piecemeal reforms, someone once described it as a balloon. The challenge is of squeezing one bit of the balloon is the balloon goes somewhere else. If you are looking at saying a true rebalancing of the system, if you are going to make a meaningful difference, a substantial difference to income taxes of people who are working, the people who are under this greatest of pump right now, then you are going to have to do something bigger than the bite size.
Next question, John Keogh from the Australian Financial Review.
Thank you, Ms Spender, and congratulations on putting together a document that you would hope that governments and indeed the Treasury is still capable of producing too, because there is some thoughtful stuff to debate in here. Yeah. Can I ask you, have you briefed the Treasurer or other members of the government about your tax plan, and how hopeful are you that they might adopt it? Was there any initial reaction? Because it does feel like there's some measures in here that kind of fit within the operating framework that they're at least canvassing for the budget at the moment.
Sure. So I shared it with the Treasurer's office. I've shared it with the Treasurer, and I hope to meet in the coming weeks and discuss it in more detail. But I think I wanted to release to the public before sort of discussing it too hard with the government, because I think that's where the debate's going to come. And actually, frankly, that's where the pressure needs to come from. It is from the community. It's why we're launching a community campaign on this, because I think people are spooked by tax reform, and I think that the government doesn't recognise how broad support there is. And if you make the case to Australians, the difference that you can make. And, you asked at the start, Tom, about things I was surprised at. I was surprised, to be honest, when I really did the numbers on 100 grand, how different those numbers were. That if you earn 100 grand on wages, $23,000 worth of tax, 100 grand on capital gains, 7, 100 grand, if you're splitting it, 13. If you're earning 100 grand in your super fund and you're retired, absolutely nothing. And so it's, there are some pretty stark numbers out there. And I think this is what the government really, needs to react to. So I will go further with the government. I've mentioned it to the Prime Minister today. I'm pushing further on tax reform, and he knows it, and I'll keep on pushing, across the government.
And on the community feedback element, how do you treat that? If there's overwhelming feedback on don't touch negative gearing, you adjust as you go and figure out more revenue. How do you how do you treat that?
I think you just have to I'm going to keep on looking at it. I mean, appreciating it. But I think it's both listening and also making the case. And I think that's what sometimes we've actually forgotten to do in politics is you actually have to make the case. If you looked at Howe and Costello in what they did in GST, they made the case for a long period of time and they actually brought the community with them. And I think this is what we need to do. You both need to listen and to make the case. In terms of the Australian community, I think that Australians have a really good sense of fairness. And that's where, particularly, I'm saying on things like transitions, I'm really interested in what the community thinks is fair. Because people have made decisions, it's important to respect that decisions have been made. At the same time, we can't just entrench one decision and make sure that, close the door afterwards so that nobody else gets the same benefits, because that can actually even further entrench some of the advantage that some of these things do.
They made the case. They lost the two-party preferred in 1998. Is that going to be the sort of thing?
It's hard, though. I mean, it's making the case is hard. But I think the community is a long way further forward. I think some of the polling that came out, for instance, in the SMH around, support for things like capital gains tax reform and negative gearing reform, it's strong. So, I think the door is much, much more open than to a whole new tax, which is what the GST was. Sorry.
Next question, Deborah Nesbitt from the Bloomberg Tax.
Hi, Allegra. I'm going to get to the specifics, I suppose. Sure. Tomorrow, I think Senator David Pocock is introducing a motion about taxing gas exports, and I'm just wondering what your views are on that, given those exports are extraordinarily lucrative for the big multinational New York Stock Exchange listed companies, and they pay very little, if any, tax here. Is that something that you would support? And I guess what's your feeling about how that'll go in Parliament?
Look, I think there are a couple of, there's both the short term and the long term in relation to sort of gas and resource taxes. In the short term, we have a war that is affecting gas and oil prices. And I think we need to learn the lessons of 2022 and not make the same mistakes, where Australia's gas exporters earned about $40 billion worth of extra revenue out of LNG. But in terms of tax benefit to the Australian people, I think it was around $6 billion, or it was a significantly smaller amount. And I think that really matters because that money that sort of big spike in terms of their earnings and their profit, didn't come because of their great long-term investment decisions or anything else. It came because there was a war. It was a war-driven price spike, and then there's a war-driven price spike on Australian resources. I believe Australians should get more of that return. So what I want the government to do is actually to introduce a legislation that would capture that sort of gas price spike or that resource price spike when it's war-driven, making sure that more of that goes to the Australian people, purely when it's based on a war and that sort of a conflict. In terms of resource taxes, we do need to change resource taxes. So back in the 1990s, we earned around the Australian taxpayer got about 30 cents back for every dollar of oil or gas that was sold. Now we get around 7 cents. No, so that's pretty stark, and it's happened over a long period of time. So there is really broad reform that needs to happen in that space. The question I think is really important is you need to make sure that people can still invest. You need to create investment certainty. I think that's a really important part. And so, what I'm looking at is specifically around, different resource taxes, and I'm genuinely looking at this as part of future white papers. How can we restructure our resource taxes so that we capture more of the price upsides without reducing incentives to invest?
Next question, Shane Wright from the SMH and the Age.
G'day, Ms Spender. Shane Wright from The Age and the SMH, and welcome to the room where Peter Costello announced that tax-free super for people of retirement age.
Hey, lucky them.
I was there and I remember it very well. A lot of us have been playing tax fantasy football for a long time.
Yes.
I was just wondering, you've talked about, your speech goes heavily into the housing problem for many young people, and you've said, right, if you get a tax cut, if you're on 100K, $1,600. That will barely scrape the side for somebody who's looking to get into the housing market on 100K. I'm just wondering, in terms of your tax changes, have you considered how you would encourage more supply? Does that include an incentive from the feds to the states around stamp duty?
Sure. So great question. I think, and you're absolutely right. I think this is about getting more money into the hands of younger people and in people who are working hard and just feeling that they can't return. this is not fixing the tax system. It's not fixing the housing system. It's really focused on the tax system. We need to drive more supply. I have long supported driving more supply in terms of greater incentives from the federal government to the states. In terms of fixing stamp duty, again, this is an area where I'm looking at in relation to GST, because I think that is probably the one place that you could look at different ways of trying to change incentives around stamp duty, and it's probably around looking at the sort of GST in the future. So that is an area that I think is really, really important. Now, I think it's also worth noting in terms of this that there are some people, this is not going to fix housing or the cost of housing, but if you are one of those people who don't have a house and you are struggling because you're struggling with your mortgage, this makes a difference right now. And this does also affect, basically young people going into housing and who they're competing with when they're at those open houses, making sure that they have more money in their pockets in terms of being able to buy relative to property investors.
Just in terms of CGT and net gearing there, a lot of the research says it doesn't have that much of an impact in terms of new housing supply.
Yeah.
So was that conscious as you developed?
Yeah, it was, because I don't want to do things that would reduce housing supply. But the evidence, I think, and particularly the Grattan Institute was saying that it has very minimal impact on housing supply, and so that's why we've gone down the CGT and negative gearing route.
So was it something a lot of the policy suggests? Only having it for new supply? Is that something you looked at and it didn't tweak the dials enough? Or?
Yeah, so I think that we looked at it saying, if you could keep it just for new supply, and we also looked at CGT to say, well, some people say only confine it to housing, reduce some these changes just in relation to housing. I think the reason why we decided to go broader is, one, is what we're trying to do is actually fund lower taxes on income, and that's on wages. That is actually the goal. The more that you kind of restrict that, the more that you can't actually fund the goal, which is to reduce taxes on wages. The second issue in relation to, in terms of new housing supply, the evidence is difficult to get, but the evidence we've got is that it's only around 15% of capital gains tax discounts actually go to new housing. So it's actually pretty small. But the danger of creating a complicated tax system is that people start to do funny things to try and make sure that what they're doing, fits into that system. So that's why we felt, given how little impact it would have on housing supply, we decided not to pursue it.
Next question, Corey McLeod from Innovation Oz.
Thank you so much for your address. One of the sections in your white paper talks about the taxation of trusts. Mm-hmm. One of the theses is we want to create more businesses of value. Obviously, family offices and trusts are sophisticated investors in many cases. How do you see any changes creating the settings, if you like, for the creation of more businesses with your white paper?
I think that I don't think it does affect that. I think the point on this is the changes in relation to trust really only is really directed around income splitting, and really to explain really the point on this is, for some people they have a choice about, they can do their job employed, by an employer, or they can do a sort of pretty similar job, but through some sort of a company which they can then distribute benefits through trusts. And then in some cases, they can then split that amount, maybe with their kids, maybe with their spouse, to reduce their tax bill. In some cases, this can earn benefits up to $25,000 less tax. So it can be really, really significant. And what we're trying to do is to say, look, don't encourage people to try and structure their affairs in a complicated way to try and minimise their tax bill. Make sure that, if the job is pretty much the same, if you could make the same income in both cases, you pay pretty much the same tax. And I think that is a principle that Australians expect, which is if you make a similar income, we expect you to pay a similar amount of tax. And so in terms of, I've worked in my own family business for 10 years. Family business, growing businesses, it is absolutely incredibly important that we fund those. But again, when we did this paper, we looked really hard to say, well, is this going to affect it? And the answer really is no. And I think, what we do need to do is get more funding into those sectors. So, for example, superannuation, at the moment has around halved its exposure to venture capital and private equity over the last decade. You know, we need to be backing innovative businesses. Superannuation is backing out of that. So what I've been pushing separately is to change things like the rules on Your Future, Your Super, on the rule RG97, which currently inhibit big super from making investments in these high growth innovative businesses. So, you know, that's where I think we need to be directing, directing our policy energy is around backing those businesses. Again, we've got, the government has put a lot of money into these big investment vehicles, you know, like the NRFF and others, but they're not investing in the innovative end of the world. You know, they've just been investing in Arnott's. I think Arnott's has been around for quite some time. I've been eating Tim Tams for decades, really. So, but the point is that why is the government directing public money towards Arnott's when we should be directing public money, if we're trying to drive innovation, to young, high-growth businesses? That's where it needs to go. So this tax proposal doesn't affect that investment, but there are many other things the government should be doing right now in terms of driving investment in innovation, because that's where we really need it. That is what's going to build the wealth and productivity for the future.
Thank you.
Obviously, the biggest cohort is the PAYG taxpayer.
Yeah.
Next biggest in number is small business. Did you look at them here, or is that a future white paper? Or what are the?
In terms
you
of
mentioned innovation specifically,
yeah.
but you know, if a young person right now wants to start up a small business.
Yeah.
Is that a viable landscape, or is that becoming unviable as well?
Look, I think what you're seeing is actually young people aren't starting businesses. And again, I think this comes down to risk. You know, I often use the example when my mum started her business, she owned a flat. Tell me, you know, which young Australian owns a flat before they can start a business, because they just don't have that risk. They can't take those risks because it's so hard to get into this. So I think we do need to go much harder in terms of how do we finance small and innovative businesses, the super system, the government, and also banks. Because if you again look at the system we've got right now, back in I think it was the 80s, around two-thirds of bank lending went to business, one-third to mortgages. Right now, two-thirds of bank lending goes to mortgages, one-third to business. Like, we just have to recalibrate our economy back towards investing in productive enterprises, not pushing everything into the property market. Sorry.
Tom Crowley from the ABC.
Hello, Allegra, and thank you for your speech and for your paper. Running through these questions, there's a theme about the parallel conversation that we think is happening in the Cabinet room at the moment about tax reform. We don't know much about it. We can feverishly speculate, as I often like to do. But we can sort of proceed in some good faith, perhaps, and assume that there's a similar degree of problem admiration to you and a similar enthusiasm, as you've demonstrated here, to think about the politics, think about the sellability, think about what the electorate will accept. That's a conversation that you've chosen not to participate in by engaging in politics as an independent, even though many people would imagine that if you were in a major party, you might be a candidate for an economic portfolio and might sit around a cabinet table, or perhaps a shadow cabinet table in a much reduced opposition. I won't ask you necessarily to get to
Where's
that.
this question going, Tom?
I'd like you to speak a little to that trade-off. You're advocating here in public for tax reform. Why is it that you see that you can achieve more doing that than seeking to be sitting around a cabinet table and having the same discussion with a cabinet submission instead of a white paper?
Good question. Because when I got into politics in 2022, no one was talking about tax. The whole conversation was, don't worry, from both major parties, we're not going to touch it. You know, in 2025, you know, there was, I think the coalition said, oh, we're going to cut fuel excise. That was their big tax reform, and the government was going to take a couple of cents off, you know, of income taxes and tax simplification, which were certainly much better policies than the other ones. But it has not been reformed. So the point is that the point is that if I was in the major parties, they are failing so far to have the hard conversations about things that matter to people. I think that is why I got elected, because I'm willing to have difficult conversations and to have them publicly. In the old days, people did used to produce green papers and white papers to really talk about these problems and bring the community on. But we seem to have given up on some of that. And I think there's really something to be said for bringing back some of those pieces. So I think I've had more impact as an independent on tax than I would have in any of the major parties, because I'm not afraid to speak and I'm not afraid to bring the community on or to listen to the community. And I think that really, I don't have to, like the shadow treasurer has identified intergenerational equity as an issue. But, is saying, oh, no, well, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that. Even we know that those things do impact intergenerational equity. That is the trade-off and that's the cost, I think, in terms of making decisions and in terms of actually speaking out and having influence. So I think it is about being willing to speak up on the issues that matter to the community and to speak and honestly put real solutions forward, because, when was the last time, particularly, oppositions and others have put forward this sort of detailed analysis? I don't know. Independence. Yay, independence. Sorry, I'm not so good.
There have been a few articles and theories around a centre-right party. If you hit a brick wall on this, would you think about that? You could get a few recruits from Table 4, perhaps.
I'll do a poll afterwards and see what they think, I'll see how we go.
What do you think, though? I mean, if the Liberal Party goes the way it's going right now, is that a viable option?
Look, I'm saying I'm really proud to be an independent, and I'm proud of the impact that I have had as an independent. And I have to say, at the moment, I think the Australian public is sick to death of party politics, the revolving door that keeps on revolving in terms of party leadership and things like that. I think people are really looking for right now is policy solutions to the issues that matter to them. And so that's what I've been focused on. That's why I came to talk today.
Ron Misen from the AFR.
Thank you, Ms Bender, for your speech. Morris reliably informs me that we've got a bit of time, so I'm going to go for a triple header or a one and then a double header follow-up. You reflected on the importance of budget neutrality in what you've put forward, and you also talked in your answer just then about the difficult conversations that need to happen. We do have a decade of significant structural deficit.
100%.
I mean, how should we interpret your thoughts on that based on the paper put forward and your views about not taking in more tax? Is the answer to that structural deficit therefore having to rein in spending?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I don't think you can do significant tax reform without being budget neutral. I do not think the Australian people will stand for it. And I think economically right now, we have a high level of government spending. And so I think this is the wrong time to say, okay, Australians just pay for more of it. I don't think, again, the Australian community would stand for it. I think the lessons of the Howard Costello and Keating Hawke tax reform is budget neutrality. And I think economically, we don't have a lot of headroom. That's right. We've got really significant pressures we need to address, but we need to do that through spending restraint. Because we do see, we do have budget deficits, as you say, for the next 10 years. We do have bracket creep coming for the next 10 years. And if you want to increase defence spending to 3% of GDP, that's going to cost you about $260 billion as well. I mean, I think the first two things cost about $300 billion each. So there's some very big price tags out there on stuff that is going to be a pressure here. So that is why I believe it is critical that it is budget neutral, that it is not adding to debt. And at the same time, I think, spending's at 26.9% of GDP. That is the highest historically outside of the pandemic. It has gone up very fast in the last 3 years. I think that we do need to pull it back.
And then sort of slightly off tack, at the last election, there was sort of a view that perhaps the independent movement had hit a high watermark, at least as it related to coalition seats. But you came very close in some Labor seats, Fremantle, Bean here in the ACT. Is the future of growth in the independent movement perhaps in Labor seats, in your view? And then just sort of tangentially related, obviously Tom asked you about the political party question there. There is obviously an implication in not being a political party in terms of spending during election campaign under the new rules that come in on July 1. Is there scope for a party of independence rather than a centre-right party? Is there even an embryonic conversation about it? An independent, we're all under the same banner, but we can do what we like.
Look, I think there's a lot of speculation, and a lot of people are talking about, to me, people on the street come and talk to me about it. I think it's true that the government has deliberately, and the government and the opposition together have deliberately made it harder for independents to be successful with the new donation rules. They have, tipped the scales towards the major parties, and I think that is a very, very deliberate move. So I do think that there's the opportunity for more communities to have people who are willing to speak and vote for them, because I think that's the feedback I get from people actually. Sort of quite often is people say, what I like about you, Allegra, is that you're willing to speak and you're willing to disagree. And I've got colleagues here from the crossbench. We don't agree on all things. We agree on a lot of things. A lot of times we vote together, but a bunch of times we don't. And I think people actually like that. That people are willing to speak up and make the case, but also be constructive. So I think that's what people are looking for, is to be constructive, but to still be able to have a free vote, rather than the kind of Labor Party approach, which is if you don't vote with everybody else, you're out of the party. I don't think that's actually meeting the moment either from the community. So I do expect, this movement to grow in the next election.
And is the growth in Labor seats, do you think?
Well, I think, it will be. I think it'll grow across the community. We'll see which communities are interested. I hope Farrer might be one of them.
Thank you.
Shout out to Michelle Millthorpe. Next question, Jacob Steinman from AAP.
Thanks, Ms. Bender. Jacob Steinman from AAP. A few of the suggestions in your white paper have already been, hinted at, that it looks like the government is considering changes like concessions to the capital gains tax, negative gearing, potentially even looking at trusts. How optimistic does that make you about the upcoming budget, and if those are the majority of tax reform package that the Treasurer does bring, how satisfied will you be with that?
I think the things I'm really looking for are ambition and budget neutrality. I think it is an opportunity to be ambitious. When we started writing this white paper, I wasn't sure what would happen. I've been surprised on the upside that there seems to be more talk on tax that hasn't sort of gone away and been ruled out yet, and I think that is a positive piece. So I think it is about ambition. It is about making a meaningful difference to people's lives. But budget neutrality is also really important, because I think otherwise people will see this as a tax grab. If people, and I come back to what I said in the speech, people don't want, I think, tax reform that's like, oh, this is better for the country and we're going to take the money. I think people want tax reform which is like, okay, this is going to help people who need it right now, and I'm willing to make that exchange. So I think those are the two things I'm really looking for.
Dan Holmes from the Mandarin.
Hi. I just wanted to ask a little bit about fairness. I think just about every change to the tax system in my life so far has been sold on the premise that it's going to make the tax system fairer for everyone or fairer for the country. We've looked at changes in some pretty radically different directions, if you like, in terms of flattening the tax system, making it more progressive, introducing the GST. I mean, what is your idea of fairness in the tax system beyond the line of intergenerational inequality? And does the idea of a social wage factor into that, given you've talked about budget neutrality?
So I think often this idea of like horizontal fairness and vertical fairness, and I think the idea of horizontal fairness in Australians, which is pretty much if you earn about the same, you should pay about the same amount of tax. Like I think if you've got the same capacity to pay, you should pay about the same. I think that is a pretty strong value, and again, I think that is why it is worth considering some of these concessions, because I think some of that has been affected. I think the other vertical fairness is that fairness sort of between generations piece, to make sure, because I think everyone wants the next generation to do well. But I think it's about only around 11% of Australians right now who believe that the next generation will have a better life than they do. So there's a real pessimism about what is happening to the future. So I think those are kind of two ways that I have really looked at it. In terms of sort of social wage, or guess that broader piece, then there also has to be the question of sort of dynamism in the economy. And, the best thing that we can do is give the opportunity for people to have great jobs, build great companies, because that builds the overall strength of the country, it builds the overall prosperity, and it builds the household prosperity as well. So for me, a big part of this is actually just saying, making this environment right for business as well. I haven't spoken about it so much in this speech because it's been focused much more on the personal tax system, but I think that is the best way to do it. And yes, that doesn't mean it does mean we have to look after the most vulnerable. And something I should have said also in the speech is to say, for older Australians, on balance, on average, that generation has done very well. That doesn't apply to everyone. And so we have to be really careful to make sure that we're not, this isn't sort of negative impacts on vulnerable older Australians. It's actually looking at the averages. So I'm trying to, it's a bit of a balancing act, frankly. I think that's what fairness is really about.
Thank you.
On people paying their fair share, did you look much at write-offs that hit sort of grey areas? Every tradie I get in offers me a cash price and a real price. I can't be the only one unless there's a certain look about me.
So maybe easier, Tom. I want to be clear that most people and the vast majority of Australians follow the rules and do, and I think just try and do the right thing by the rules and also the right thing by their families. So this is for me not a saying, oh, well, they've taken advantage or anything else, but it's just saying, look, we've written the system. Is that system actually delivering what we want? And so I haven't, and I think that's really what I'm trying to do. In terms of those specific pieces, no, I haven't looked at, it's more of those tax integrity issues. I haven't particularly looked at those.
Julie Hare, freelance journalist.
Hi, thank you very much for your speech. So good to have such a meaty discussion about such an unpopular subject. Yes. So more than 50% of school leavers now go to university. Yeah. More than 40% of low socioeconomic or students from low-income families study arts, humanities and social sciences. Student debt is at an all-time high, and as a policy known as job-ready graduates, a Morrison-era policy flushes through the system. Those degrees are now cost over $50,000. They're indexed and are increasing over time. On top of that, more students are getting full-fee postgraduate degrees, for which they also delay repayments, which are repaid through the tax system. Mm-hmm. So my point is that those vast debts get repaid through the tax system, which means that they will negate or not make any difference to these people with large debts through your policies. How do you kind of balance out student debt, delayed repayments through the HEC system, and benefits through your ideas?
I think there will still be benefits through cutting these taxes, and people are at a stage of different stages of repaying their university fees, and not everybody goes to university, so it's a range of different situations. At the same time, I think that the jobs ready graduate and that level of student debt that has grown over time is part of the problem that is facing younger Australians. That is an area where I think the government really does need to act in terms of those job ready graduates. I know it's expensive and it's difficult. I think, honestly, with the changing world with AI, we are going to have to think quite hard and quite differently about how we best prepare our young people to jobs and to opportunities, because the old paths are not going to be the future paths. I think we have to accept that, and I think the university sector in particular needs to be much more innovative in terms of how it deals with that.
Do you have any insights into why the government has not acted on job-ready graduates and keep walking away from it? It was sent down to ATEC, but in recent comments, Jason Clare has been kicking the can even further down the road.
I think it's really expensive. And that's what the conversation I've had with the Minister is, that it is really expensive. And I recognise we have a significant budget deficit, and so it is difficult to say, well, this is how we need to rebalance. That's why I think it's a broader question of, like, how do we make sure the university sector is actually delivering what people need when people need it, particularly in an AI world.
But it's also very damaging to those 40% of...
I agree with that.
Yeah.
But I think that I think we're going to see real changes here.
Okay.
I think in how people consume education.
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure.
Nick Stewart from Ability News.
You made the point that governments of both sides have failed to just kick the can down the road on genuine tax reform for the last 2 decades. Over the last 2 decades, we've also seen the two-party vote collapse. Do you draw those two things together? Is politics essentially about the sharing out of economics? And is that why there is a complete disillusion with both major parties?
I think economics is about growing the pie, about building prosperity, and then also making sure that everyone can share in it. That's what I think. That's what Australia has worked for Australia: building prosperity and building fairness at the same time. I think that one of the reasons why people have abandoned the major parties is because they haven't dealt with some of these hard issues. Let's look at housing. It has been building for 25 years. And neither the state, federal or local governments have done enough about it. And so now we have reached a crisis point where it is harder and it's more difficult and expensive to unpick that. So I think this is, I think housing is probably the best example of avoiding the hard issues until the point that they become unavoidable and a crisis at the same time. So I think that is why people, I think, have abandoned to the major parties to degrees, because they haven't been willing to do the hard things, and because they haven't delivered some of the things that just people expect. And, I always have a funny, something I find funny, which is like, the problem with governments is they're monopolies. And we know what monopolies are like. That they take for granted communities, they ignore services, and they play politics. Like, this is what frustrates, I think, many people, is I sit in question time, I listen to, the debate, and what we hear time and time after again is the point scoring. Oh, it's your fault. No, when you were in power. No, it was your fault. Oh, well, you said this. It's not actually dealing with the substantive issues that are changing people's lives every single day, and that's what people genuinely want people to focus on.
Patrick Cummins from The Guardian.
Hi again. I had a question. The Guardian's been doing quite a lot of reporting on this massive transfer of wealth from one generation to another. Yeah. And that this is entrenching a lot of this intergenerational inequity that you referred to in your speech. Mm-hmm. So why haven't you considered, or why haven't you included an inheritance tax in your plan?
Okay. So I've spoken to a lot of economists who say that inheritance taxes don't work. What you normally do is you raise very little money and you sort of get the middle class who can't avoid it, and you don't capture actually the sort of vast bulk of wealth. I think Australians do not want an inheritance tax, and I don't support it. It's neither good economically, and I think the community does not want it. But I think what I'm trying to do here is to say, what do people do want? Is they do want people's hard work to pay off. That is very Australian. And so I think if we can work out how to make sure that hard work pays off, so that, more people can access, I think, the good life that different generations did, that's what people really want.
John Keogh from the AFR.
Thank you, Ms Spender. Actually, I was going to ask this question anyway, but I had an email pop in my inbox from my story talking about your tax reform plan that's just appeared on the AFR website. And you do represent one of the wealthiest electorates. Yep. Many people there would no doubt use trusts, company structures, capital gains tax discounts, all those sorts of things. This person, who I assume might live in your electorate, but I'm not sure, says, how do you propose, and I'll remove the expletives, screwing over people in your own electorate, you should go on a fact-finding tour in Watsons Bay, Double Bay, Rose Bay, Paddington. But more seriously, can I just ask on that, like, how have you been able to manage the internal politics of your own electorate, where no doubt people are using a lot of these sort of structures quite tax effectively?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a difficult and challenging question. I mean, and that is why I've been talking about tax really publicly for the last 3 years. I released a tax green paper which basically said I'm worried about intergenerational equity, and I think we need to lower income taxes, and these are some of the things that we might need to consider. I handed a bunch of those out at polling booths. Like, it has really been sort of out there. And again, next week, I'm going to be doing 2 events in the community, and I welcome the person who has written to you to come and talk to me about this. I do genuinely want to have a conversation about this. I think people are worried, and I do understand that people want to make sure, have made good decisions, are looking after their families, and that matters to them, and they, want to make sure that can continue. At the same time, I think I also get many people in the electorate who go, I'm really concerned about what's happening in this country and how we can move forward. And so it is about having an open conversation. It's not being afraid to have that conversation and have that conversation publicly. I've put it out as a white paper. It's a proposal. They can change my mind. I'm all ready to listen, but you've got to start somewhere because we have a problem here. And what I will ask this person is, what would you like to do about it? Because if you want to, some people say just cut spending. Well, how are you going to cut spending enough to deal with this? Genuinely, if you've got a budget deficit that's sustained, if you've got bracket creep that's sustained, if you want to spend more on defence, that's about $900 billion in the next 10 years. How will you pay for it? If you're saying, well, these are other kind of areas that they want to talk about, I'm all ears. But I think it's got to be concrete. Let's have that debate.
Thank you.
So we in the fourth state love a winners and losers table when there's a policy. Would you suggest that instead of a losers table, these people that would pay more tax, they're still winning, but they're winning a bit less, even if that sounds a bit Trumpian?
Yeah, no, I'd say that. I genuinely say that this reform actually cuts taxes on most people, right? So I know that, and I'd say that to you, John, as well, that this is about reducing the tax rate. So I know people may say, well, it's going to reduces the tax concession on capital gains tax. It also reduces their tax rate on every single dollar that they pay in tax. So that is a benefit to them, and it will be a benefit, to their kids. So I think that's why I think neutrality is so important, because I don't think you can just go straight after and say, hey, we want to tax you more on your assets, but we want to keep the money. I think you need to give that money back, but give it back in rewarding hard work, because this is what this country is built on, reward hard work.
We do appreciate debate over slogans here at the National Press Club, so thank you for your time and your ideas today, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in thanking Allegra Spender and his membership of the club. Thank you.